Michelle Good is a Cree writer and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada, and her poetry was included on 2 lists of the best Canadian poetry in 2016 and 17. Five Little Indians, her first novel, won the HarperCollins UBC Best New Fiction Prize, the Amazon First Novel Award, the Governor General's Literary Award, and was longlisted for the Giller Prize. After working for Indigenous organizations for 25 years, Michelle obtained a law degree and advocated for residential school survivors for over 14 years. She went on to earn a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, while still practicing law and managing her own firm. With the Brantford Public Library, we're happy to welcome Michelle Good.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to talk to readers. Readers of the world unite. And so I wanted to do a couple of things tonight. One of the things I like is to talk a little bit about the context of residential schools and the background to these schools, because I think it's very important that people understand them in the context of the time, which was colonial Canada up until, the 1990s, but also that it was only one aspect of the colonial effort that was being made with respect to removing Indigenous people from their territories to allow for settlers to take over. So, when you think about colonialism, if you Google colonialism or colonization, you get this incredible, pages and pages and pages upon pages of, articles, academic studies, those kinds of things. And so I like to just go back to the simple definition of colonialism, because it really says it all quite clearly. And that definition is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically. And so that is, in effect, what the residential schools initiative was part of. It was one implement in what I like to refer to as the colonial toolkit. And I'm just going to talk about a few things historically, as well as the historical beginnings of the residential schools. And then after that, I'll read a bit from the book. And then hopefully we can just have a conversation. So going back to the 1870s, before I jump in there, it's important to understand that there was no border. There was no difference between Canada and the US as that pertains to Indigenous people. It was just all one territory. And in fact, the border now bisects some Indigenous communities, and that's why there are special legal provisions about border crossings for Indigenous people. So, but anyway, I'm saying this because I'm going to talk about the American government for a second here. In the 1870s, the American government encouraged the slaughter of the buffalo as a strategy to conquer the American Indian Plains or Plains Indians. General Sheridan is quoted as saying, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cows and the festive cowboy." I've never quite been able to figure out what he means by festive cowboy, but anyway, be that as it may. The recognition of the buffalo as food, clothing, and shelter as being the primary source of sustenance for Indigenous people was also not lost on Canada. Approximately 4 million buffalo were exterminated on the Canadian plains. Sir John A. Macdonald defined this, where very often these buffalo would be just left, their tongues would be taken or their hides taken and just left to rot. And he defined this, Sir John A. Macdonald, as a policy of submission based on a policy of starvation. And so, so before these schools even come into, I guess, an institutionalized level, we have this going on where the people are being basically starved into submission. In 1875, Catholic Bishop Vital Grandin, who was a very strong proponent of the residential school system, stated, "We instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood." And so when you hear people refer to these schools as a well-intentioned venture gone wrong, think about that. It was not. The intention was clear from the beginning, was in effect to kill the Indian in the child, so to speak. In 1879, not long after Grandin's statement, the Department of Indian Affairs had just basically been established as a department of the government with the passage of the first Indian Act in 1876. And the intention of the federal government was on education as a method of assimilation, so to speak. And a study was commissioned by Sir John A. Macdonald, who wasn't the prime minister then, he was the head of the new Department of Indian Affairs. And he commissioned a study of the Indian boarding schools in the United States, which had been operating in conjunction with churches for some time at that point. And an individual by the name of Nicholas Flood Davin was tasked with going to the United States, and in particular, taking a look at the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, which was the model school, if you will, that was structured by the American government in a contractual arrangement with the churches in the US. He was very impressed with the idea, with the structure of funding Indian schools, where the government had kind of an arm's length relationship in the sense that they funded the churches to administer the schools, and they basically didn't have administrative responsibility other than to fund the schools, so to speak. And his recommendation was, wherever the missionaries have schools, the government should utilize those schools if possible. This is to say, a contract should be made with the religious bodies controlling the school to board, educate, and train industrially a certain number of pupils. This should be done without interfering with the small assistance at present given to the day mission schools. And I'll get to the day school part a little bit later. Davin reported that in the States that those schools were being used to force assimilation. And he went to, as I said earlier, to the Carlisle School, and its founder, whose name was Richard Henry Pratt, claimed that he had discovered a new way to deal with the Indian problem by education and assimilation. And he stated it seemed that the United States had found such boarding schools, as they were called, to be quite effective in deconstructing young Indians. Okay, I want you to remember those words, deconstructing young Indians. The objective couldn't be more clear. This was not a well-intentioned thing. This would ultimately turn into a life and death experience, both culturally and literally. In 1883, in a House of Commons debate, Sir John A. Macdonald was noted as promoting residential schools that they be constructed off the reserve, far from the reserve. And very often children were sent very, very far away from their homes. He stated this, that when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with the parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. And so we see again this this drive to basically erase Indigenous people from the North American continent. In 1907, jumping forward a little bit more, there was an outcry among the parents of residential school students because of the record number of deaths of children in the schools from tuberculosis and other disease, but primarily tuberculosis. And so in response to that, the government commissioned the chief medical officer with the Department of Indian Affairs, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, my hero, in 1907 to sample, to go and look at a number of the schools and to make an assessment about what was going on. And he reported back in part. I mean, he did a full and complete report, which I think is probably still available in the archives, but he stated, Indian boys and girls are dying like flies. Even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. He was noted also as saying that if our intention had been to create something for the successful transmission of tuberculosis, we did it with the Indian residential schools. Upon receiving this report and the passionate recommendations of Dr. Bryce to, remediate this situation, then head of the Department of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott, and by now Sir John A. Macdonald was Prime Minister, fired Bryce. Bryce responded by writing an op-ed piece, if you will, for the Ottawa Citizen, entitled The Story of a National Crime. And he wrote about what he saw in the residential schools and how it was just such a completely unacceptable way to deal with. And the words that he used were our allies. And I'll digress a little bit here because it's so important to understand or to remember or to consider that Indigenous people were the military allies of the French and the English. And the way that the geography of Canada ultimately was established was in large part due to the allied relationship between the French and the English and the Indigenous nations. And so he refers to them in this op-ed that he did as our allies. And I think that's a very important consideration. Duncan Campbell Scott's response to that was, it is readily, and this is a quote, it is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness, habituating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared toward a final solution of our Indian problem. It is quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received therein. So this man, charged with Indian Affairs in Canada, was fully aware of the incredibly high death rate. My mother contracted tuberculosis in residential school and ultimately had to spend 3 years in a TB sanatorium as a result. She was lucky, she lived, thank goodness. But he knows, but he needs a final solution. And it's kind of disgusting to me to think that it was a Canadian bureaucrat who coined the term final solution long before that term was coined by Hitler during the Second World War. In 1920, after much debate in Parliament, the attendance at these schools was made mandatory. Before it was mandatory, the attendance was steadily declining because people didn't want their children to die. And this was not the education that they expected that their children would receive. And so to this, in the lobbying effort to make the schools mandatory, Duncan Campbell, this was Sir John A. Macdonald. I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole objective of this bill. And so with that, I think it's much easier for people to understand that there was a very malevolent objective here. This was, as I say, an implement in the colonial toolkit to create a Canada that didn't involve Indigenous people, that didn't involve Indigenous economy, Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous culture, or Indigenous people. This was about making a place for, well, actually, it was really a cash cow. The, people did not consider, I guess, the original imperial countries that came here to colonize Canada. It was not primarily, let's make a beautiful home for ourselves. It was about, exploiting the resources of this country. And so I think that makes it a lot easier for people to understand what a terrible experience this was, and that its intentions were in no way benevolent. I used to think that the objective was assimilation, and assimilation certainly was a part of the objective. But if assimilation had really been, the fundamental objective here of, blending Indigenous peoples into a non-Indigenous society, where was the support for these kids? First of all, where was the education? They got no real education in these schools other than, the girls were trained for domestic service, the boys were trained for, manual labor. And then when the money stopped, because when these kids turned, 16, the funding for them, the annual stipend that the churches would get for each child, was ended. And so the children were just unceremoniously no longer required to be there. Many of these kids tried to find their way home, couldn't find their way home. Home was never the same. And there was no training for them. There was no support for them when they left the schools. There was no place for them to go to seek support, to seek training, to seek a way to, blend in or assimilate into the Canadian society. And so I changed my thinking about that, and I decided that that really this was a Canadian genocide. And it's hard for us. We have all been force-fed this notion of Canada as the, true north, proud and free, and, the perfect example of democracy, goodness, and truth and justice for all. And then we have the experience of Indigenous people in this country, which contradicts all of that. Following World War II and the discovery of the Jewish Holocaust, Winston Churchill called the Holocaust a crime without a name. And there was a gentleman working with the League of Nations, then would ultimately become the United Nations, Raphael Lemkin, and he created a definition combining two Greek words. And that definition, of course, was genocide. And when you combine all of the implements in that colonial toolkit, what you see is an agenda of genocide, a genocidal agenda. At the same time, or shortly thereafter, after this crime without a name was named as genocide, the Genocide Conventions were developed, and within those conventions, there was a definition that was created. It's a 5-part definition. Virtually every one of those applies to Indigenous people, but in particular with residential schools, the one that most applies is the 5th definition, which is the removal of children from one group to another. And that's exactly, of course, what we see with the residential school endeavor, is the removal of children. And I ask people to imagine that, to imagine communities right across this country completely bereft of all school-age children. And people talk about intergenerational trauma and intergenerational harm, and they tend to think of it as being linear, right? As starting with the first child that goes to residential school and then, passed down to subsequent generations. I see it in a far more circular way when you think that the grandparents of that child, when that child is taken, has had their role as educator, as teacher, removed from them. Likewise with the parents, the aunties, the uncles, the siblings, the cousins, and so on. It was an attack on the very fabric of Indigenous society, but that intergenerational trauma is circular and continues to be circular throughout our communities as we continue to try to reach some form of reconciliation. And in terms of reconciliation, there's a lovely analysis that's done by the Yellowhead Institute, and I really recommend that you Google it and take a look at the Yellowhead Institute. It's an Indigenous think tank. And last year, I think it was maybe a year and a half ago, they did an analysis of the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and to see how far the implementation had gone with those recommendations. And of the 90 some calls to action, 6 had been addressed. Okay, remember, these calls to action were in the report in 2015. 7 years later, 6. And each of those 6, all of those are one-offs, if you will. They're things that could be, one of them, for example, was increased funding for Indigenous arts. And so you see increased funding in categories for Indigenous creators, so to speak. And another one was funding the Tribunal for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. That is incredibly important. At the same time, it's also one thing. They just had to fund it. And what's missing from the efforts of the federal government with respect to the calls to action is addressing the systemic and the fundamental machinery of Canada, of how Canada operates, and how and I believe that comes from a failure to understand that those colonial objectives continue to be at the foundation of our major institutions. And until there is that kind of recognition, and also a recognition of the injustices and what I consider are illegalities in terms of the taking of lands and resources, there will never be meaningful or substantive reconciliation. Not until Canadians understand that in order for Indigenous people's circumstances to change, non-Indigenous people's circumstances have to change as well. I think of reconciliation almost in a bookkeeper kind of way, when you get your bank statement, you have to reconcile the balance with, your checks that you've written and so on and so forth. Bringing it to balance. And that has not been done yet, and it has not been given consideration. And that's what is really at the root of the land back movement. If anybody is aware of that, is, it's one thing to say I'm sorry, but that's largely performative. It's another thing entirely to promote substantive change. And so I'm going to be providing the organizers with a reading list of some materials that are really useful in bringing the truth of what really happened to the fore. And it's also just really good reading as well. So that will be available after tonight's event. And so with that, I thought that I would give you a little bit of background about my book, Five Little Indians. The bio that our friend read was a little bit outdated. It's won several more prizes since then, most notably Canada Reads, which I couldn't have been more astonished, quite frankly. When I made the decision to write this book, I first of all had to decide, am I going to choose nonfiction or am I going to choose fiction? And, you know, with my law degree and with the, you know, advocacy and the, you know, activism, basically my whole life, I could have easily done that. But, you know, there's been a fair amount of work in the academy. There's been memoirs by survivors. There's been, you know, academic works. There's the Truth and Reconciliation Report. There was still something that was really missing from all of that incredible work that was being done. And that was evidenced by the ubiquitous chorus, if you will, this question that just drives me to distraction. And that question is, why can't they just get over it? It's history. It's history, but it's recent history. The last school closing, of course, in 1996. So I decided, well, the reason that I wrote the book was to answer that question. Do you really want to know why they can't get over it? Here, read this. And I made a decision to go with fiction because it gave me a greater latitude, if you will, to include all of the things, all of the impacts that survivors experienced. And the book, of course, focuses mostly on their time after the school and how they struggle to even achieve a modest life, carrying this tremendous burden of psychological injury. And so that was why I chose fiction, because I felt, as I said, it gave me this greater latitude as a writer. Things can be true without being factual. And I also felt that it was a safe place for people to, you know, they could dismiss it if they chose, because it's just fiction after all. But what has happened, to my, you know, profound satisfaction, is that once folks get into the book, they can't dismiss it. And I get emails from readers all the time, and they're amazed that they didn't know this was going on. One of them I'll never forget was saying just that. I had no idea, but now I'll never forget. And, you know, so that's what I wanted to do, and hopefully to not only encourage, you know, a greater depth of compassion, but also to inspire people to do what they can, to use their franchise, to use their privilege. And, you know, privilege is not a dirty word. It's just a fact. You know, to support meaningful reconciliation that will allow us to return to a position of self-determination and self-governance in a meaningful way, with recognition of our rights to the benefits of the land, if you will. So that's why I wrote it the way I wrote it. So I'm going to read a little bit, as I don't know how many people have read the book. I just am going to read a section about Clara, one of the 5. And this is after she's joined the American Indian movement, got herself into a whole whack of trouble and injured. And her friends have found a way to get her to an Indigenous healer in the Cypress Hills, which is just 40 kilometers from where I live now, and it's the most beautiful place. Anyway, and so she has just arrived and she's trying to orient herself to this. And so here we go. Submersed in the kind of darkness one only finds in the country, away from cities and their relentless spray of light, Clara's mind raced to put it together. She had no idea where she was. A furious wind howled through the darkness. It was only when John Lennon's voice, mournful and high, rose above the wind that she remembered they were at the old woman's cabin. Clara's eyes adjusted slowly, and the outlines of the log walls emerged from the pitch darkness. The sudden movement when she sat up triggered a sharp pain in her shoulder, and she remembered her injury. She cradled her arm in front of herself, taking pressure off the shoulder, and slid her bare feet into her boots. She walked as quietly as she could, but when she opened the front door, Clara felt her presence behind her. What are you doing? I'm getting John Lennon. He's a dog. Dogs live outside. Not this dog. Yep, him too. I'll go outside and sleep with him then. Fine. She tossed a quilt in Clara's direction. Go ahead. Clara walked through the door toward the makeshift shelter where John Lennon was tethered, wiggling with joy now that he could see her. It's going to snow, you know. Clara didn't even look at her, but thought she heard something else, something other than irritation in her voice. All right, light a fire in the porch stove. He can come in there. If it weren't for the weather on that shoulder, I'd let you sleep out there. Her mumbling faded as she headed back into the cabin. Clara dropped to her knees in front of John Lennon. Okay, boy, I'm here. She scratched behind both his ears as he contorted himself into almost a complete circle with all that tail wagging and dancing around. She untied him and they made their way back to the porch. The sky seemed to hum with the spray of stars laid bare of clouds by the wind. Clara thought of another night sky, the full moon, small and cold, a bitter orb above the Badlands as she lay there wounded between her and death. Laying there wounded and certain her death was upon her. John Lennon had put himself between her and death, lying next to Clara against the deep chill that night, turn around his fair play. The near full moon was golden and so bright it cast shadows. Still, there was something so completely unfamiliar about the earth in darkness. No matter how confident Clara walked in the daylight, storm clouds recaptured the stars as she closed the porch door behind them. Clara collected bits of bark and dry wood splinters from the wood box and used them to coax a few small flames. John Lennon sat next to her, resting his bulk against her side, as she slowly added bigger and bigger kindling, the flames growing strong enough to ignite the rounds of poplar from the neatly piled box. Clara left the wood stove open and sat there, the dog's tongue lolling, her arm throbbing. The cabin creaked, and above it all, Clara heard a persistent tinkling, as though the wind was laughing. Okay, mister, I got you this far, so no more complaining. Go to sleep. John Lennon curled up in front of the wood stove, and Clara sat in the old overstuffed chair where the old woman had been sitting the evening before, drinking her tea as the darkness seeped in around the cabin. It wasn't long before the warmth of the wood stove and John Lennon's soft snoring lulled her back to sleep, the thick quilt wrapped around her. The morning sun slowly filled the porch, and Clara could feel John Lennon staring at her in an urgent silence. She opened her eyes and he smiled at her, his ears half down, tail thumping the floor. Yeah, come on. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and opened the door for him. He raced to the tree line, circled 3 times before lifting his leg, making sure he always had eyes on her. He'd always been protective, but after Willow Flats, he was even more vigilant, and nothing could calm him if he couldn't see her. Clara hoped he would mellow out again. Clara quickly stuck her head in the cabin door and looked around the neat and organized interior. The old woman was not there. Clara wondered how she might have missed her going out before sunrise. She stepped inside and washed her face, wondering if she would be able to wash her clothes. Everything she owned was in the Falcon, which no doubt had been seized by the police. She stood in the porch doorway as John Lennon sniffed around the perimeter of the clearing. She pulled on her boots, trying to ignore the ache in her shoulder. Come on, boy. John Lennon dashed towards her, tongue lolling, ears pricked. Let's check this place out a little. He ran ahead of her, his huge paws tossing up the thin layer of snow from last night's storm. Clara wandered along the tree line, trying to orient herself. All she remembered from the night before was the rough ride in the back of the truck, her and John Lennon hiding under the tarp, and then the old woman in the porch beckoning her into the cabin. Next thing she remembered was waking to John Lennon crying out for her. She put it together that she must have passed out. Clara came around the corner of the cabin and found herself on a trail that wound through a grove of black poplar, now all naked but of their leaves, their twisted black limbs framed against the sky. The path was slippery with rotting orange-black leaves, partially covered in snow. She kept her eyes on her feet, careful not to fall. When she looked up, she found herself in the clearing. At its center was a dome-shaped structure made of living willows, their boughs woven loosely together to form a ceiling. There was an entrance, a carefully crafted arch, the top no higher than her waist. Inside the structure was a fire pit, bare of any remnants of a fire. Over to one side of the clearing was a carefully stacked woodpile, secured under a tarp, and in front of it a clearly well-used fire pit. She looked back over her shoulder and saw John Lennon sitting quietly in the middle of the path, a few feet from the entrance to the clearing, ears forward, eyes fixed on Clara. "This way, buddy." She slapped her thigh gently. He didn't move an inch. "What's up with you?" He shook his head and huffed. A prickle of fear worked its way up her spine, and she walked slowly away from the clearing. John Lennon bounded toward the cabin when he saw Clara heading back up the trail. She looked back over her shoulder at the structure and could have sworn she heard soft singing underneath the tinkling she'd heard well into the night. It was only then, as she wandered back toward the cabin, that she saw them, dozens of small and very old colored glass bottles hanging from the poplar trees in clutches of 2 or 3. A rainbow against the black twisted limbs, they swayed in the now gentle breeze, tinkling as though giving voice to the wind. She wondered how long they had hung there, witness to the changing seasons, and the dark feeling left her. The music of the bottles took her back to those days before Indian school, back to those long walks with her mother through the birch groves, her mother up ahead, Clara transfixed by the songs of the angels in the treetops. When she rounded the front of the small cabin, the old woman was back, her small footprints in the snow leading to the front door. Clara looked down at John Lennon. "I'm okay, man. You stay out here for now." Clara rekindled a small fire in the porch stove and pointed to where he'd slept the night before. As was his habit, he turned around 3 times, then flopped down and curled up tight, his eyes following her as she walked through the front door. The old woman was bent over, loading up the wood cook stove with poplar rounds. She'd straightened up and wiped the wisps of hair off her forehead. "You're back." She lifted a large black cast iron fry pan off its hook on the wall and set it on the stove. "You too." Her face burned red at her smart-ass impertinence. One day, she thought, "I will just learn to shut up. You know, can't remember if they told me your name. It's Mariah." "I'm Clara." That's what they said. She was a wiry little woman, not more than 5 feet tall, hair almost completely white in a neat braid that fell below her hips. She wore a calf-length cotton skirt, red with tiny yellow flowers, the hem falling just over the top of her wraparound moccasins. She pushed up the long sleeves of the blue turtleneck sweater and exposed her tightly muscled forearms, her hands obviously accustomed to hard work. She had piercing brown eyes so dark they seemed black, and the lines around them suggested mirth as well as age. Clara turned to her again. "Hey, I'm sorry about last night and the dog. I don't want you to think I'm not thankful. I am. I didn't mean to be disrespectful." Her stern face softened for a moment and she beckoned. "Come on over. I made some bannock. There's jam too from the last huckleberries of the season. Try some." She put a plate of warm bannock on the small plank table and pushed the mason jar of jam towards her. It was a relief to see her soften, and until that first bite of flaky, soft bannock, melted butter, and tart huckleberry jam, Clara hadn't realized just how hungry she was. Mariah laughed as Clara reached for a second piece before the first was done. "I'll make a stew for dinner, get you fed right." She placed a tin cup of black tea in front of her. "You can help me peel potatoes." Mariah put a large bowl of potatoes and a paring knife next to Clara. Clara finished the first piece of bannock, and the second tasted even better than the first. Then she turned to her and said, "It's not just words, Mariah. I am so thankful to you. I would be in jail if they hadn't brought me here." "Well, you wouldn't be the first," she said as she expertly browned the venison that would make their stew. The way she moved around her little kitchen made Clara think of her mom, making something out of nothing, always finding a way to push back the hunger. "Does someone hunt for you?" Clara wondered if she had dropped the deer herself. "People come here pretty regular. Some bring meat if they've had a good hunt. I have a trap line too, rabbits. You don't get afraid living out here by yourself? She tossed Clara back a box of wooden matches. Days are getting shorter. Light those lanterns, would you? This place is home. Nothing for me to fear here. Clara had never lit a kerosene lamp before, but the room was soon shining with the yellow flames after she figured out the first one. Have you always lived here? My grandmother raised me here, hid me, kept me out of the Indian schools. Rolling over her like a dark cloud was the memory of her mum telling Clara why she had to go to school. I had to go. My mother died of the coughing sickness, so my father brought me here to my grandmother when I was very small. I saw him a few times after that, but he left me to her. She was a healer. Clara glanced at Mariah as though she was hearing Sister Mary talk in her head. Witch doctor.
Okay, thank you. Anyone who wants to ask questions, please put your questions in the Q&A, okay? So we have a few here already. So first question, how would you compare what they did in spreading TB in residential schools to how they handle the spreading of smallpox with the blankets?
It's the same thing, really. I mean, there was, with the smallpox blankets, that was an intentional thing. And I have to look at it as being equally intentional, that they did nothing about the conditions in the schools and they allowed the death of all these children. Because as we heard Duncan Campbell Scott say, the fact that they're dropping like flies isn't enough for us to make changes to what we're doing, because they knew what they were doing. They were exterminating us.
Second question here. What did you draw from to gain that almost laissez-faire way that trauma, injury, and pain became normalized and expected?
Oh, that's in the chat. Okay, there was another question in the...
Yeah,
this
one came first, yeah.
Okay, the chicken or the egg? What did you draw from to gain that? Oh, I drew from my entire life. I mean, my mother went to residential school, my grandmother went to residential school, my uncles, my aunties, and I was scooped in the 60s scoop, and I was in foster care for 5 years. And I aged out at 18 in Vancouver, which of course, right at the time that this book is set. So, you know, some of those experiences that those kids had, I had as well. Plus, I started working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18, and virtually everybody that was working there was a residential school survivor. And so this was a reality that I was basically immersed in for all my life. And so I just drew on my life experience and what I knew from my own family life, my work life, my activism, my advocacy as a lawyer for survivors, and so on.
Okay, thank you. As a librarian, I try not to use the word Indian in our school library, as our Indigenous students find it offensive. However, this is challenging as several high-profile books by Indigenous authors, including, of course, Miss Good's novel, use Indian in the title and text. Can you comment on who, when, where, why this word is accepted to use, if at all, especially by non-Indigenous people?
Well, I generally don't think it's acceptable to use by non-Indigenous people. But you have to look at the time. In the 70s, that's what we were known as. They called us Indians. We weren't even, it was just sort of making a transition slightly from Indian to Native. And then from Native in the 80s, it went to Aboriginal. And now, you know, there's more of a focus on just considering the nature of our identity as being Indigenous. And so, you know, that's, and especially with respect to my title, I intentionally Well, that title came to me, Five Little Indians, and it's, that horrible nursery rhyme, one little, two little, three little Indians. And I did it, well, as I've already said, was because that was the nomenclature of the day, if you will, but also because I wanted people, potential readers, as soon as they looked at the cover of this book, that they would understand that this was about a phenomenally racist experience. And so that's why I used it. And I think for educators, librarians, and so on, that kind of an explanation is probably helpful, especially if the work that is being referred to is within a time that is different from the time that we're in now. And remember, no matter what you call us, legally, we're Indians. Okay, we are governed by the Indian Act. That is what we are defined as legally, is Indians. And so sometimes I think that we use that term to highlight that fact, that our status, that's not a cultural designation, that's a legal designation, Indian. It's not a racial designation. You can have 100% Caucasian blood and be an Indian. And this came from the Indian Act provision, where it's changed now, but where a non-Indigenous woman or an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she lost her Indian status. She was considered white. But if a non-Indigenous woman married an Indigenous man, she became an Indian. She was registered as an Indian. And there was a reason for this. And it's part of that, genocidal assimilationist agenda, right? Is take out the Indigenous nurturers, bring in the non-Indigenous. Okay, but it's important to understand that that term is not a racial term, it's a legal term. I am an Indian, legally, and by blood, of course. Yes, we still have, I see in the chat, we still have our Indian status card, which establishes our legal status as Indians. Yeah. And yes, there's a comment in the chat as well, is that, yeah, I remember I was working for a band and there was this non-Indigenous woman who had become an Indian through marriage. And she used to flash her status card and say, yeah, I'm an Indian too. And, her children also became Indian, so to speak. And as Dolores points out, that we have people like myself and my son who had to fight to get our status back. There had to be changes in the law to get our status as Indians back. And these, non-Indigenous women and their descendants continue to consider themselves to be Indigenous. It's goofy. It's ridiculous.
So Michelle, are you working on another book?
I am. I'm actually working on 2 books right now. I'm much to my dismay, I'm working on a collection of essays about the very thing that I was talking about today, about the context of colonialism and its impact on Indigenous people in Canada, ranging from the red schools to the starvation policies to all of those kinds of things. And I'm also working on another historical novel, but it goes back a bit further. This one goes back to the life, it's modeled, or it's based on the life, a fictionalized account of my great-grandmother. She was born in 1856. I was born in 1956, and I find a nice kind of resonance in that. But she never saw a non-Indigenous person until she was in her late teens. And so in her as a character, even though, of course, we had a much longer history of contact in eastern parts of Canada, we have a pre-contact woman, and then we have a contact woman, and we can see the impact in that one lifetime. And so it's basically about that.
So if you wanted to do some research to find out if someone attended a residential school, how would you recommend doing that? My grandmother, we suspect, was a survivor and suffered with mental illness and other lasting effects, and we wondered if she was a survivor. She has passed and never spoke of it.
I think that we had a whole process legally of how we would get confirmation that someone attended a school, but they kept bookkeeping. Sorry, they kept bookkeeping records, okay, because they got this annual stipend. I think they got it quarterly, actually, to pay for the room and board of these kids. And so they would provide a roll of children that were in the school to justify their budget requests for money to support the school. And you can probably get those through the Department of Indian Affairs. You could make that request. What you might also do, and it might help narrow the search, is to look at the schools, the residential schools that were sort of in the area where she was from. And you could suggest in your inquiry that it may have been this school or that school and so on. But it's a challenge because lots of records were destroyed in various ways and for various reasons, but it is a challenge, that's for sure. I wish you luck with that.
What should Canadians do to help ensure the 94 calls to action are realized?
Yes. One of the examples that I use is that as Indigenous people, we are at the top of the list of all of the negative statistics, okay? We form a tiny percentage of the population, and yet we have the highest rate of suicide, addiction, apprehensions of children in foster care, all of the negative statistics, we're way up there on that list. Nonetheless, we organized, and in organizing, in our activism, we were able to change the Constitution. We changed the Constitution of this country. And believe me, nobody was making that easy. I was there. Nobody was making it, oh yes, I think that's a good idea. Let's change the Constitution and recognize your rights, but we did. And that's my recommendation, organize. If you're serious about this, organize, use your privilege and speak to your politicians, okay, about what you expect from them. Write letters, organize letter trees, write letters and tell those politicians what you expect of them with respect to reconciliation. If we could do it, and you have to remember there were provisions in the Indian Act that prevented us for up until I think 1950 something or other from hiring lawyers, okay, to deal specifically with rights issues. This activism started long ago, right at the time treaties were being negotiated way back in the 1800s. But we've never stopped. We've never given up. And we have made tremendous gains. In spite of the challenges we still face, we've made tremendous gains. And if non-Indigenous people organized on our behalf, acted as though they were allies, like we were allies to the death, then maybe we would see something happen.
So if we are hearing I didn't know, how can this important part of Canadian history become a part of the curriculum in our schools?
Books like mine. And this is something that people can do as well. In British Columbia, they've now made it mandatory that there be an Indigenous component of the curriculum in that province. And I think that would be a huge move towards deepening the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and also deepening the understanding, of the true history, not the history, that Canadians have been force-fed, but the real history. Yeah.
Is there a difference between the day schools?
Mm-hmm. The day schools were just that, day schools. People didn't stay overnight. They were not residential boarding schools. But there's currently a class action where abuse that happened in day schools is being well, settlements are being negotiated for compensation for that as well. But that's basically only the difference. And those were the schools that Sir John A. Macdonald was saying weren't adequate because the kids were still under the influence of their savage parents. Right? But many day schools persisted nonetheless. Yeah.
I have one final question here. What is your opinion of the Pope and his apology for participation of the Catholic Church?
You know, I know that there are many Indigenous people that take comfort from that. They feel comforted, it helps them to be at peace, and for that, I'm thankful. However, he didn't apologize on behalf of the church. He apologized on behalf of some members of the church. And these are weasel words, as far as I'm concerned. And they also, you know, we've got closets full of apologies. The churches started making apologies in the 1990s. Okay, 2010, well, the federal government refused for decades to apologize. 2010, Harper finally apologized because it was a necessary term of the settlement agreement for the residential school resolution. But they must be more than performative. And that's really what they are. They're just trying to buttress their, you know, their political credits, if you will, or, you know, to buttress their sense of piety and goodness for the, you know, the church partners. And quite frankly, I'm offended by them. And, you know, until we see people actually rolling up their sleeves and doing things to make substantive change, those apologies mean nothing to me.
So, Michelle, ultimately, what do you want people to take away from the novel? Ultimately, what would you like them to take away from it?
Well, that understanding, right, of why the harm from these schools continue to impact the generations and the communities. Important to understand, we didn't experience these only as individuals, we experienced them collectively as people in the context of colonialism, as I tried to talk about a little bit earlier. And so, as I said, you know, I hope that my book helps people to understand that it wasn't so long ago that these children were so brutally injured psychologically, as were the communities, and that it continues to resonate. And to just, you know, be more compassionate, be more engaged, be more understanding. And to stop asking that stupid question.
Yeah. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure. We hope we can come back again someday. And yes, we all love the book and thank you for it.
Well, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to people about these things. And you know, I hope that together we can make a better Canada.
Yes, yes. Okay. All
yeah.
right. Bye, everyone. Bye,
Good
Michelle.
night, everyone. Thank you very much. Good night.